Hello and welcome to Runshaw College's Teaching and Learning channel. The title of this video is The Importance of Visual Communication in Cognitive Learning. However, my main aim is to actually highlight the true strength of presentation programs such as PowerPoint and put a spotlight on some of the common mistakes and misuses that we are all guilty of. With that in mind, I've created this whole presentation in PowerPoint, and if you'd like to learn how I did that, stick around until the end and I'll give you my best tip towards creating consistently impactful PowerPoint presentations. The first and most important thing to understand about PowerPoint is that it is a visual aid to your own narration. It is not designed to impart full subject knowledge. With that in mind, let's have a look at why I believe visual communication is so important to cognitive learning. So how does this actually link to learning theory? Well, before we get into that, we have to look at what we actually know first. There's two main learning theories that link to this presentation. First up is cognitive load, followed by dual coding. So if you look into cognitive load, what we're looking at here is working memory. Now this is Mayer's idea that the brain capacity, the working memory, has a finite amount of capacity. Once we reach that limit, we can no longer take on any further information. This is known as cognitive overload. So how do we actually avoid that overload? Mayer came up with the 12 principles of multimedia learning. This is them there. Now we're not going to go into those, although there is another video on this channel if you would like to learn a little bit more. What we're going to look at today is coherence, signaling, redundancy, and modality. And I will give you a very quick run through of what they actually are. Coherence, first up, is the idea that people learn better when extraneous words and pictures and sounds are excluded rather than included. Signaling is the idea of highlighting where you want the attention to actually be shown. Redundancy is the idea that people learn better from graphics and narration than from graphics, narration, and on-screen text, similar to how you're seeing this presentation so far. And finally, modality, which is the idea that people learn better when words are presented as narration rather than on-screen text. So I'm talking now, it's very difficult for you to read that text and listen to me at the same time. However, it isn't difficult for you to look at this image and understand that when I say auditory narration with a simple image works just right. That's cognitive load in a nutshell. As we go into dual coding, this is the idea that there are two main types of stimuli. We have word and we have image. Now, images are a purely visual piece of information, and words are something that can be both read and obviously heard. The two main senses that we're talking about here is visual and auditory. As the information is coming into our brains through those two senses, we are storing it as audio files and visual files in that working memory. This is then processed together and sent through to the long-term memory, and thus learning has taken place. So why does this actually matter? Well, in the process of a lesson, the student's brain is inundated with information and it's having to make decisions on what to listen to and what not to. Essentially, it's filtering out all the excess in order to bring its own image out of that lesson to decide on the learning that has taken place. This is done through that audio and visual loop. As the information comes in, the TRN, which is the thalamic reticular nucleus, actually inhibits the flow of information to prevent the prefrontal cortex from becoming overwhelmed with information. Now, in this scenario here, we've got a perfect combination of visual and auditory learning. The TRN is able to combine these together and pass that on to the prefrontal cortex. However, when there is a huge, overwhelming amount of stimuli, the TRN is not very good at choosing what to pay attention to. In this scenario, it's sending purely visual information to the prefrontal cortex and it's choosing to ignore the audio information that's coming through from your own narration. Dual coding is the idea that we remove those extraneous details and we give a good balance of imagery and audio to combine together to send through to that long-term memory. So that is learning theory summed up. We're going to refer to it in future if we come back to it as cognitive learning, and we're just going to throw it all underneath that one big umbrella. So now let's transition on to what is visual communication. Well, it's the transfer of an idea, a message, or a piece of information through visual means such as pictures, signs, and symbols. It's a relatively simple concept. However, the way it works is fascinating. Essentially, what we're looking at is a form of top-down processing. This allows us to take multiple facets of information from a single image. Take this one, for example. We know that it is a warning sign and there is danger of some sort. We understand that it is of an electrical nature. This then gives us the idea that it's to do with machinery of some description, and it is most likely in an industrial setting. All that from just one little triangle. Visual communication allows for the high-speed transfer of complex information really efficiently. This is especially important when you take the results of a 2015 study by Microsoft, which states that the average attention is actually a mere 8 seconds. What do you do when you're working with 8 seconds to grab someone's attention? Well, in the case of Lego, they came up with this, which is a fantastically simple image that conveys an idea of creativity and imagination with immediacy, with efficiency. It's also adhering to the ideas of coherence, of signalling, of redundancy, and modality. And if I was to try and explain this in text, well, this is what it would look like. Not exactly a very accessible or interesting piece of imagery for you to look at. Lego, on the other hand, get that message across in a very, very clever way. Essentially, this is the art of economy. It's the idea of getting complex information across in creative and engaging ways. And they're not the only people that have done it. You've got the McDonald's Wi-Fi, you've got the mixed up BMW parts, and you've got the Nescafe alarm clock cup of coffee. There is one other, which is my personal favourite, and it does go to show that a little bit of humour can actually go a long way. In order to do this successfully though, there are some key elements of visual communication that you have to be aware of. First up, you've got colour, you've got typography, and then you've got composition. Colour is an easy one. You really notice it though when it goes wrong. What you're looking at here is all the highlighter colours available in Microsoft programs. We all are guilty of highlighting text at some point. It does not make it easier for students to read. Typography, again, is also about accessibility. You want to use a sans serif font. You want to make sure that if you're highlighting particular words, you're using bold, not underlined. If you change this now and you go to a serif font with underlining, what you're actually doing here is you're making it harder for some students to read. You also want to avoid all capital letters, and you must absolutely avoid gimmicky texts like this. My advice is stick to something nice and simple like Calibri. Use only bold for when you want to highlight certain letters. The final one here is composition, and this is probably the most important of the three. Composition is essentially the layout of your slide. Now, we all know that the title goes at the top. This is pretty obvious. But have you noticed that every slide so far has had a subheading or the title of information that we're looking at on the left, whilst where I actually want your attention is usually located on the right. This is because I'm building up a compositional language for you to be used to and experience as we go through. Now, this is the most important thing for the reason in front of you right now. What you're actually looking at is the image of a grid map in the entorhinal cortex of your brain. This is what your brain is currently projecting onto the screen in front of you. Grid cells are the structure within which our brains encode spatial memory. And because the brain encodes abstract knowledge in the same way that it represents spatial awareness, what we're actually looking at is the organizational structure of memory. This is what Sherlock Holmes is referring to when he talks about his mind palace. This is what it actually looks like. The entorhinal spatial maps that we're looking at, they actually restructure to incorporate the location of learned rewards. So when we look at this in the context of a slide layout or a composition, if a student is presented with a consistent composition, then their grid cells participate in neural coding of the goal locality. Or to put it more simply, their brain actually learns where to direct their attention, allowing for faster and more accurate processing of information. The best way of remembering everything so far is to think of it as a language. And the more you use consistent terms and structures, the more fluent your students will become and the easier they will be able to decode complex information from that language. You can think of it like being in a room where two people that are near you are speaking a foreign language, something that you don't understand. The vast majority of what they say will fade into background noise and you can't really understand or access the information. But if they're to say a singular word that you do recognise, then your brain will focus in on that word and it becomes this flashing beacon to you. Visual communication works in the same way. You need to establish a clear language and be consistent with it so that when your learners do become fluent over time, they have reduced that friction of learning and they are easing that information transition. There are a couple of rules that we need to discuss in order to do this successfully. So when we come to setting up a PowerPoint ourselves, we must be aware of these rules. First up, this is a big one for me. Make sure that you've never got any more than 20 words per slide. And if you think you've got too much information that you need more than 20 words, actually, I would use the argument of you need more slides. You want to make sure that the font is accessible at all times. The color palette must always be complementary and you want to be using coherent imagery. And finally, always establish a clear composition. What I'm actually going to do now is I'm just going to flick over to a screen record and I'm just going to show you a super quick way that you can establish a clear and consistent visual language with your learners and produce PowerPoints that allow you to be creative, but also allow your students to get the most from that learning resource. So once you're in here, you want to go over to View and then click on Slide Master. This will give you the templates of all the standard slides. If you scroll up and then select the master slide at the top, what we want to do now is change your color palette. PowerPoint does all the work for you here. It gives you some really nice color palettes that'll make sure that your color combinations work and that they are accessible. Once we've chosen the palette that you want, just double check that you're using the right text, and then we're going to start to make changes. Now, first and foremost, we need to get rid of that white background. So right click, format background, and then just change that background to a nice light blue. Now, I don't really like the contrast of black on the blue, so what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to select both of those text boxes, go to home, and then just turn that text to a darker blue, just to turn down that contrast. Once we've done that, I'm just going to scroll down on the side and I'm going to find my favorite slide. This is fantastic because it allows you to just put images straight into this text box. Now, as you become more confident with it, you don't have to use this. You can use any that you like. But to start off with, I really recommend it. I'm just going to make this a little bit smaller because I don't want to have too much text in there. But I've got my title, I've got a body of text, and I can have my data and my imagery over here. Once I've done this, I'm just going to go back to Slide Master and I'm going to close the master view. And then when you go here, you can see the slide has already changed. And then when I click on New Slide, Picture with Caption is right there waiting for me. As I said, Picture with Caption is really helpful because all I have to do is click on here. It brings up my pictures. I can select the icon that I want to use, and then it throws it straight in there and it does everything that I want it to do. That is a super quick way to just set up slides how you want, have a play around with it. You'll come up with your own designs and things that work for you. All we're looking at is a consistent composition and a palatable color palette that allows students to access the text that's on there.